Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into a fascinating subject that touches every single one of us: money. Our sources for this deep dive are powerful excerpts from a book that makes a very compelling argument that doing well with money has less to do with how smart you are, and a lot more to do with how you behave.
That's exactly right. Our mission today is to really unearth how human psychology, our emotions, and our unique personal experiences truly shape our financial lives, often in really surprising ways, and what universal lessons we can maybe draw from that. So forget the complex formulas for a minute. We're focusing on those foundational soft skills that lead to real, sustainable financial success.
When we talk about behavior over brains, the source material kicks us off with two truly striking stories. Really highlights the contrast. On one hand, you've got this brilliant technology executive, a real genius who designed key Wi-Fi components, made immense wealth. Yet this was a guy who famously carried bricks of cash, flaunted his freight train, unbelievably, once threw thousands in gold coins into the ocean just for fun, like skipping stones.
Wow, just throwing it away.
Yeah. And another time, shattered a hotel lamp, was told it cost $500, pulls out $5,000 cash, throws it at the manager, and basically says, "Don't ever insult me again." Well, as you might guess, that kind of behavior couldn't last. He ultimately went completely broke.
Now compare him to Ronald Reed, a janitor and gas station attendant from rural Vermont. He was actually the first in his family to graduate high school, and for most of his life, there wasn't much that really stood out about him. Lived in a modest two-bedroom house, bought for $12,000, worked as a gas station attendant for like 25 years, swept floors at JCPenney for 17 years.
Just a regular guy.
Totally. Yet when he died at 92, this quiet, unassuming man left over $8 million to local charities, like the library and hospital. His secret: it wasn't a lottery win, wasn't some big inheritance, it was simply patience. Consistently saving what little he could and investing it in blue chip stocks.
Yeah.
Those big, stable companies.
Yeah.
And
that contrast is just incredible. It immediately hammers home the core idea, doesn't it? That financial success is way less about raw intelligence or fancy education.
And much more about behavior. The soft skill. And surprisingly, it's incredibly hard to teach, even to really smart people.
It feels almost absurd, right? A genius goes broke, a janitor builds millions. It makes you want to ask, what were they thinking? Are some people just crazy with money? But the source makes this profound point, one I find really empathetic. No one's crazy.
Yeah, that's a fascinating angle, because everyone's unique experiences fundamentally shape how they see money, how they interact with it. Think about it. People from different generations, maybe wildly different economic backgrounds, or even just folks who lived through periods of hyperinflation versus stable prices. They all learn vastly different lessons about risk, reward, saving, spending.
Things get baked in based on what you personally live through.
Exactly. What seems totally irrational to you might be perfectly logical to someone else. Because, as the source says, what you've experienced is more compelling than what you learned secondhand. Research even shows our lifetime investment decisions are heavily anchored to whatever the market was doing in our early adult years, regardless of our intelligence or education level later on.
That's powerful. Our personal histories create these unique money filters.
Absolutely. Take the example of lottery ticket buyers. From an outsider's view, maybe like ours, spending money you arguably can't afford to lose on such long odds. It might seem illogical.
Right, you look at the statistics.
But flip the perspective. For someone paying for a tangible dream, maybe the only tangible hope they feel they have, when building real savings or wealth seems impossibly out of reach, that purchase suddenly makes perfect sense. It helps explain a lot of decisions we see. And we have to remember, we're all pretty new to this modern financial system. The 401k didn't even exist until 1978. We're all kind of figuring it out.
And there's another layer here, too. The history of how the modern American consumer, became the modern consumer provides even more context for these varied behaviors.
Oh, definitely. After World War II, there was this huge fear of slipping back into the Great Depression. So policymakers, they deliberately tried to foster a culture of spending. Think about it. Low interest rates, the GI Bill making homeownership suddenly possible for millions, new kinds of consumer credit. Borrowing for homes, cars, appliances became cheap, and importantly, socially acceptable.
Normal, even encouraged.
Right. Plus, there was this hidden productivity boom from the 1930s finally unleashing, meaning loads of new stuff could suddenly be mass-produced. And crucially, the gains from that boom were shared more equally back then, much more so than today. This created a strong, broad middle class with a shared expectation of what a good life looked like, including consumption. So debt went up, sure, but it was mostly manageable because incomes were rising pretty much across the board.
So this culture of spending, using debt to get ahead, it really took root.
Precisely. But then, around the 1970s, things started to shift. Economic growth became way more uneven, concentrating wealth at the very top. But people's expectations for that middle-class lifestyle, they didn't change, and that cultural acceptance of debt was still there. This led to what the source calls a big stretch. People whose incomes weren't really rising started taking on massive debt to try and keep up appearances, to match the lifestyles they saw around them, often amplified by media and advertising.
Keeping up with the Joneses, but on a national scale, fueled by debt.
You got it. And this whole dynamic kind of got locked in after the 2008 financial crisis, where the recovery measures, well, they largely benefited those already at the top. So even with recent economic improvements, that feeling of inequality, the expectation that the system isn't quite fair, persists. It helps explain some of the political and social tension we see today. People feel like the system isn't working for them, and social media just pours gasoline on that fire with constant comparison. It's a really potent backdrop to why no one's crazy when making their own financial calls.
That historical perspective is so important for understanding today.
Okay, stepping back a bit. When we look at those huge success stories, the Bill Gateses of the world, it's tempting just to say, wow, pure genius, pure skill. But our source suggests there's another really crucial element, often overlooked, right?
There absolutely is. Success often looks like it's purely skill, but the source really emphasizes the profound, often invisible role of luck and its twin, risk. Take Bill Gates. He attended Lakeside School, one of the only high schools in the entire world with a computer back then, thanks to a teacher who had incredible foresight. Think about that. In 1968, out of maybe 300 million high school-age people globally, only about 300 went to Lakeside. That's 1 in a million luck, literally.
That statistic is just staggering. A tiny needle in a colossal haystack. But luck, as the book points out, have a doppelganger. Risk. Bill Gates had a close friend at Lakeside, Kent Evans. Equally smart. Shared his business mind, his ambition. They planned to go into business together. Kent tragically died in a mountaineering accident before they graduated high school. The odds of being killed on a mountain in high school, also about 1 in a million.
Wow. Same magnitude, opposite outcome.
Exactly. The same powerful force, just working in the opposite direction. Both are forces largely outside individual effort. It reminds us that nothing is as good or as bad as it seems. It's incredibly hard, maybe impossible, to truly know how much of an outcome was skill versus just random chance. And that makes it dangerous to just blindly emulate extreme successes like, say, Cornelius Vanderbilt or John D. Rockefeller. Their daring, sometimes law-breaking behavior could just as easily have led to ruin. So the lesson for you, for us, is maybe focus less on the specific actions of these outliers.
Like trying to replicate every move.
Right, and focus more on the broad patterns of success and failure that seem more universally applicable, timeless principles.
So less about trying to be the next Bill Gates, more about identifying those core principles. And one of those principles, the book argues, is the real secret to wealth. And it's probably not what most people think.
Yeah, it's not necessarily about being the best investor or finding the next hot stock. It's about being a good enough investor.
Yeah.
For a very, very long time. Warren Buffett is the classic example. He accumulated, 99.9% of his $84.5 billion net worth after his 50th birthday. The vast majority came after his mid-60s.
That's incredible.
His skill is undeniable, of course, but his real secret weapon, time, just letting things compound for decades.
That's the power of compounding, isn't it? It sounds so simple, maybe even boring, but the numbers become just mind-boggling.
They really do. The book runs the numbers. If Buffett had started investing at 30 but retired at 60, a pretty normal, successful career, right?
Yeah.
He'd likely have ended up with around $11.9 million. Not bad.
Not bad at all, but
instead of $84.5 billion, that difference is almost entirely down to the extra decades of compounding. Even look at someone like Jim Simons at Renaissance Technologies. His fund compounds money at an astonishing 66% annually. That's like 3 times Buffett's rate.
Unbelievable returns.
Yeah, but he didn't really hit his stride until he was 50. So he had less than half the number of years to compound compared to Buffett. Result: significantly less total wealth, despite the higher rate. It just shows how what seem like small changes in growth assumptions can lead to ridiculous, impractical numbers over long periods. Compounding really goes wild when you earn pretty good returns that you can stick with and which can be repeated for the longest period of time. Consistency in time.
That's such a lesson in patience. And it suggests, kind of counterintuitively, that while there might be a million ways to get wealthy, some through luck, some skill, some risk,
Yeah, getting wealthy can happen fast sometimes.
there's maybe only one reliable way to stay wealthy.
Exactly. The source argues there's really only one way. Some combination of frugality and paranoia. Think about Jesse Livermore. Often called the greatest stock trader of his day. Made the equivalent of over $3 billion in today's money during the 1929 crash alone.
Wow, timing the crash perfectly.
Yeah, a genius at getting wealthy. But what happened? He ultimately went broke. Died by suicide. He was terrible at staying wealthy. Capitalism is hard. It's volatile. Things break. The ability to just stick around to survive the downturn's longevity that's paramount. There's a quote from a billionaire head of Sequoia Capital, the venture firm. He said their enduring success comes from always being afraid of going out of business. That constant vigilance.
The healthy paranoia.
Kind of. It means avoiding ruin at all costs. The book mentions Rick Guerin, a contemporary of Buffett and Munger. Brilliant guy, but he was in a hurry. Used a lot of margin loans borrowing to invest more. Then a market downturn hit in the 70s and bam, wiped out. Buffett and Munger survived. Guerin didn't. So your goal really should be to become financially unbreakable. Because compounding, that magic engine, only works if you can give an asset years and years to grow. You have to survive to let it work.
Staying in the game is the game. It brings to mind that famous Joseph Heller quote. Someone told him a hedge fund manager made more in a single day than Heller had earned from his entire novel Catch-22. And Heller just replied, yes, but I have something he will never have.
Enough.
Exactly. It perfectly captures the danger of that insatiable appetite for more. The book uses the example of Rajat Gupta, former McKinsey CEO, already had something like $100 million.
Yeah, already incredibly wealthy by any normal standard.
But he wanted to be a billionaire, got caught up in insider trading, went to prison, threw away everything.
It perfectly illustrates the problem of the goalpost moving and just relentless social comparison. The ceiling of who you can compare yourself to is so incredibly high. No one ever really hits it. It leads to this battle that, by definition, you just can't win. Enough isn't about being overly conservative or lacking ambition. It's about recognizing the point where striving for more starts to risk things that are truly invaluable.
What are those invaluable things?
Well, the source lists them. Your reputation, your freedom, your family, your friends, your happiness. These are things that are never worth risking, no matter the potential financial gain. Knowing when you have enough to secure those things is maybe your best shot at actually keeping them long term.
And it seems like our perception of enough gets really warped by what we see around us.
Yeah.
We tend to judge wealth by the visible stuff, the fancy cars, the big houses, but the source throws cold water on that, saying wealth is what you don't see. That person driving a $100,000 car, they might look rich.
But they also have $100,000 less cash than they did before buying it, or maybe $100,000 more debt. You just don't know. That's a critical distinction the book makes. Rich is a current income. Someone's rich if they can afford the monthly payment on that fancy car. Wealth, though, is hidden. It's the income that hasn't been spent. It's the stocks and bonds you didn't sell. It's the house paid off. Wealth is an option not yet taken to buy something later. It's what gives you true flexibility, freedom, and future growth potential.
It's potential energy, almost.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. There's this funny quote from an advisor to Rihanna. Apparently she was spending a lot, and he had to ask her, was it really necessary to tell her that if you spend money on things, you will end up with the things and not the money? Whew. The real value of wealth isn't just the stuff it can buy today. It's the control over your time it grants you, the ability to do what you want, when you want, with whom you want, for as long as you want. That, I think, is the highest dividend money truly pays. And it's something you can largely achieve through disciplined saving and being smart about avoiding unnecessary spending. Frugality, basically.
So control over time, not just consumption. But okay, let's be real. We're human. The source puts it bluntly. You're not a spreadsheet. You're a person. A screwed up emotional person. Which means our financial decisions aren't always going to be purely rational, even when we try really hard.
Well, absolutely. And what's fascinating is seeing how even brilliant, super rational people grapple with this. Take Harry Markowitz, Nobel Prize winner, basically the father of modern portfolio theory, all about optimizing returns mathematically. How did he invest his own money? He famously split it 50-50 between stocks and bonds, not because some formula said it was optimal, but in his word, to minimize future regret. He knew emotionally he couldn't handle potentially bigger swings, even if they might lead to higher returns on paper. He prioritized sleeping well. Or think about some academic strategies. Maybe they involve heavy leverage, borrowing a lot. Mathematically, they might look rational, promising higher returns. But in real life, they're absurdly unreasonable because nobody can emotionally withstand the potential of losing everything and still stick to the plan. You'd panic.
Right. The spreadsheet doesn't panic, but the person holding it does.
Exactly. Something can be technically true, but contextually nonsense. So if loving your investments, even if it means having a home bias, favoring companies from your own country, or even doing a tiny bit of day trading just for fun, if that helps you stick with your main long-term strategy, it can actually be way more effective than a theoretically perfect rational plan that you just can't commit to emotionally. Because staying in the game, avoiding panic selling, that has a real quantifiable advantage.
That's a fantastic point. Sticking with a good enough plan beats abandoning a perfect one.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. The book also stresses that things that have never happened before happen all the time. We often use history as our guide, our prophet for the future. But investing isn't physics. Electrons don't have feelings or bad days.
But investors definitely do, which makes precise prediction pretty much impossible. And that reliance on history looking backwards can actually make you blind to the truly massive outlier events, the black swans, that disproportionately shape the world. Think about the rise of Hitler or 9/11.
Things with no real precedent. Exactly. They change everything, sometimes for decades. Plus, the world itself changes structurally. The invention of the 401k, the rise of venture capital, shifts in how often recessions happen. All these things mean that past data isn't always a reliable guide for today's conditions. Benjamin Graham's famous investment formulas, which were revolutionary in their time, they're largely ineffective now. Why? Because, quite simply, things changed. Quite. So the correct lesson to learn from surprises, the book argues, isn't, oh, I made a mistake in my forecast. It's, wow, the world is fundamentally surprising.
Okay, so if the world is fundamentally surprising and history isn't a perfect guide, how do we navigate this? How do we deal with a world of odds, not certainties?
You need room for error, margin of safety. Think about professional blackjack card counters. Even when they know they have an edge, a statistical advantage, they never bet everything on one hand. They always keep enough cash in reserve to withstand a run of bad luck because they know it can happen. There's no moment you're so right that you can afford to bet the farm.
Because you could still be wrong or just unlucky.
Precisely. This is basically margin of safety, the concept Benjamin Graham championed. Having that buffer, that room for error, it renders the forecast unnecessary. It's all about profoundly increasing your chances of survival, of staying in the game long enough for the odds, and compounding to work in your favor. Things like leverage, borrowing heavily to invest. That turns routine, survivable risks into potentially ruinous ones. It wipes out your room for error and your chance to get back in the game later.
So avoid things that can take you out completely.
Yes. And you also need room for error against totally unforeseeable stuff. The book calls them field mice problems. It references a story, maybe apocryphal, about a tank unit in WWII being defeated not by enemy shells, but by mice eating the insulation off its electrical wiring overnight.
Wow. Something completely unplannable.
Totally unplannable. These kinds of unexpected, seemingly minor issues can sometimes do the most damage because you haven't prepared for them at all. So saving money just because, saving for things you can't possibly predict, is actually one of the best reasons to save. It buys you flexibility. It lets you adapt to surprises and even pounce on opportunities when other people who didn't have that room for error are forced into desperate measures.
That flexibility is key. And it's not just the external world that changes and surprises us, right? We ourselves are constantly evolving. I mean, have you ever looked back at your younger self, maybe photos or old emails, and just thought, what was I thinking?
Oh, definitely. All the time. Psychologists actually have a name for this, the end of history illusion. We tend to recognize how much we've changed in the past, but we vastly underestimate how much our personalities, our desires, our goals will continue to change in the future.
We think our current self is the finished product.
Pretty much. And this has a massive, often totally overlooked impact on long-term financial planning. It's incredibly hard to commit wholeheartedly to a super detailed, rigid money plan that spans decades, when what you actually want out of life is likely to shift, maybe dramatically, over that time. People like Ronald Read, the janitor, and Warren Buffett, they succeed partly because they found something that worked for them and just consistently did the same thing for decades and decades, letting compounding run wild.
Which is admirable, but
for many, maybe most people, that's just not realistic or even desirable. Our goals change, our priorities shift. So the practical lesson here is probably to avoid the extreme ends of financial planning. Like, don't plan on living on such a tiny income that it feels incredibly restrictive forever. And maybe don't commit to working 80 hours a week until you're 70, because those extreme plans are the ones most likely to lead to future regret when your values change. It's better to aim for balance.
And embrace the reality that you will change your mind about things.
Absolutely. And, crucially, don't let sunk costs. That's the time, money, or effort you've already put into something that you can't get back trap your future self. Be willing to abandon a path, a job, an investment, even if you've poured years into it. If it no longer aligns with who you are becoming or where you want to go, be merciless about cutting sunk costs.
That's great advice for life, honestly, not just finance. Okay, another powerful idea from the source. Everything has a price, and successful investing is no different. But the price isn't just dollars and cents, is it?
No, not at all. The real price of successful long-term investing is often paid in currencies like volatility, fear, doubt, uncertainty, and regret. Sure, the S&P 500 index might have increased, 119-fold over the last 50 years on paper.
Yeah.
But getting that return required enduring a truly wild ride. Multiple crashes, huge drops, long periods of going nowhere.
It wasn't a smooth upward line.
Not even close. And many investors, even sophisticated ones, try to get those juicy long-term returns without paying that price of volatility and uncertainty. They try to time the market, jump in and out. Or companies try to artificially smooth out their earnings to avoid showing any dips, like Jack Welch famously did at GE, or disastrously like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac did before the financial crisis. But these efforts to avoid the fee often end up costing you double in the long run. You get worse returns, more stress, maybe even blow up entirely.
So what's the mindset shift needed?
The crucial shift is to start viewing market volatility, the inevitable downturns, the scary headlines, as a fee you pay for the potential of higher long-term returns, not as a fine for doing something wrong that you should try to avoid at all costs. If you can accept that volatility is the required price of admission for growth, like paying tuition for a good education, it becomes much easier to endure it, stick with your plan, and let compounding do its incredible magic over time.
That's a huge reframing. Fee, not fine. Love that. And it kind of ties into another point about why we sometimes make poor financial decisions. The book says it's often down to innocently taking cues from other investors who are playing a different game than you are.
Oh yeah, that's a very common trap. Think back to the dot-com bubble in the late 90s or the housing crisis in the mid-2000s. To long-term investors focused on fundamentals and value, the prices look absolutely insane, totally detached from reality.
Right, they couldn't make sense of it.
But to short-term traders, just riding the momentum, trying to flip stocks or houses quickly for a profit, those prices made perfect sense. Their game was completely different. They didn't care about long-term value. They cared about selling to someone else for more tomorrow. Similarly, a lot of consumer spending is driven by social cues. We see what others buy, what our neighbors have, what's on Instagram, and we adjust our own desires accordingly, even if our financial goals, our income, our whole context is totally different from theirs.
We're comparing ourselves to people playing a different sport.
Exactly. So the advice here is crystal clear and really powerful. Define the game you're playing and make sure your actions are not being influenced by people playing a different game. Get really clear on your own financial mission, what you're trying to achieve, over what time horizon, and tune out the noise from everyone else playing by different rules.
That's a powerful call for self-awareness and focus. It also reminds me of the book's observation, which I find fascinating, that for reasons I have never understood, people like to hear that the world is going to hell. Pessimism often sounds smarter, more intellectual, more captivating than optimism, doesn't it?
It really does. It's strange, but true. And the book argues that real optimism isn't about being blindly cheerful or complacent. It's not ignoring risks. It's more like a belief that, despite all the inevitable setbacks and challenges, the long-term odds favor good outcomes, favor progress. Pessimism is seductive for a few reasons. One, loss aversion is baked into our DNA. We feel the pain of losses much more strongly than the pleasure of gains, so bad news grabs our attention.
Sticks with us more.
Yeah. Two, money is ubiquitous. Financial news affects everyone, unlike, say, advances in particle physics. So financial pessimism finds a ready audience. And three, progress tends to happen slowly, incrementally, almost invisibly over decades. Think about the gradual decline in global poverty or disease. Setbacks, on the other hand, happen quickly and dramatically. A market crash, a war, a pandemic, they dominate headlines. We pay way more attention to a single plane crash than to the slow, steady improvement in air safety over decades.
That's so true. The bad news shouts, the good news whispers.
Exactly. And pessimists often make the mistake of extrapolating current negative trends indefinitely into the future, without accounting for how markets adapt, how people innovate, how solutions are found. I love the Stephen Hawking quote the book uses. My expectations were reduced to 0 when I was 21. Everything since then has been a bonus.
Yeah.
Expecting things to be hard, expecting setbacks, paradoxically, can make you more resilient and lead to pleasant surprises when things turn out better than feared.
That's a truly profound way to approach life, actually. Okay, and finally, let's touch on this idea of when you'll believe anything and the immense power of stories. The book uses this thought experiment. Imagine an alien observing New York City in, say, mid-2007 versus early 2009. The physical city, the buildings, the roads, the infrastructure, even most of the people was largely identical. But the economy felt completely different. Why?
Because the stories we told ourselves about the economy had completely changed. In 2007, the story was about endless housing growth and ease of money. In 2009, the story was about collapse, fear, and uncertainty. These appealing fictions, as the book calls them, are incredibly powerful. They shape our behavior far more than objective facts often do. The source argues that when we face situations with limited control and very high stakes, think about people during the Great Plague or parents with a desperately sick child and no money, people will believe anything that offers a shred of hope or explanation.
We crave certainty, even if it's illusory.
Exactly. In finance, this means we're really susceptible to believing quackery, to following gurus, to clinging to forecasts, even though we know they're usually wrong, especially when we desperately want a certain outcome, like getting rich quick or avoiding a loss. We construct narratives, stories, to fill in the massive blind spots in our understanding of a complex world. These stories create an illusion of order and predictability in a reality that's often dominated by randomness and unforeseen events. The danger is that we make crucial decisions based on our story or limited perspective, without fully realizing that millions of other people are operating based on their completely different stories. That mismatch in narratives is often what leads to market bubbles and subsequent crashes. It's a call for profound humility about what we think we know.
Wow. Okay, so bringing all these powerful, sometimes counterintuitive ideas together, what are some of the big actionable lessons, the universal truths that emerge from this deep dive for you, our listener? We obviously can't tell anyone exactly what to do with their money. We don't know your specific goals or experiences.
Right, that's key. But we can highlight the principles that tend to work consistently across different people and different times. One huge theme, I think, is about perspective and humility. So first, find humility and forgiveness. Remember, it's almost never as good or as bad as it looks in the moment. Luck and risk are real, powerful forces, and they're incredibly hard to identify, let alone control. So respect their power when judging your own results and, just as importantly, the results of others.
Be kind to yourself and others about outcomes.
Yes. And related to that, less ego, more wealth. True wealth isn't built by showing off. It's often created by suppressing your immediate desire to buy something today in order to have more options, more flexibility, more control in the future. Put your ego aside.
That idea of suppressing the urge to spend for future freedom, that really challenges how society often pushes us to think, doesn't it? What about dealing with the fact that things will go wrong sometimes?
Yeah, that leads right into the next set of principles, which are all about resilience and accepting reality. Be okay with things going wrong. Seriously, most long-term success, whether in investing or business, actually comes from just a few rare outsized wins, those tail events. This means you have to expect many, many things to fail or just kind of fizzle out along the way. So judge your overall progress, your entire portfolio, not every individual investment or every minor setback.
Don't sweat the small stuff. Focus on the big picture trajectory.
Exactly. And remember, define the cost of success. Everything worthwhile has a price. For investing, that price often includes volatility, fear, and uncertainty. See that as the fee you pay for potential long-term growth, not a fine for being wrong. Be willing to pay that fee to stay in the game. And underpinning all of this, worship room for error, margin of safety. This is your ultimate survival tool. It provides the endurance needed for compounding to work its magic over decades. It protects you against those unforeseeable shocks, those field mice problems that can truly derail even the best laid plans.
That focus on survival and endurance, having the capacity to weather storms, seems like maybe the most underrated skill. So how did these insights shape what we should ultimately be aiming for with our money?
Well, that brings us to the deeply human side of it and the pursuit of genuine well-being. Control your time. This might be the ultimate goal. Use money to gain independence, autonomy, control over your own schedule and choices. That is truly the highest dividend money pays. Also, be nicer, less flashy, honestly. Real respect and admiration from others doesn't come from the car you drive or the watch you wear. It comes from kindness, humility, empathy, character. Spend less energy trying to impress with stuff, more on just being a good person.
Simple but profound.
It is. And practically. Just save. Save consistently. Save when you get a raise. Save even when you don't have a specific goal in mind. Saving for the unpredictable is one of the best reasons to save. It's your hedge against life's inevitable surprises and gives you incredible power and flexibility. And remember, avoid extremes. Your goals, your desires will change over your lifetime. Extreme financial plans, whether extreme frugality or extreme workaholism, make it harder to adapt and increase the odds of future regret. Aim for balance. And related to that, be ruthless about abandoning sunk costs. Don't let past efforts or investments dictate your future if a path no longer makes sense for the person you are now.
Okay. And combining avoiding extremes with risk.
Right. It boils down to embrace risk, fear ruin. You absolutely need to take some calculated risks to get ahead financially. Then never ever take a risk that has the potential to wipe you out completely. Survival is the foundation upon which all growth is built.
And finally, kind of a meta lesson on how to approach all this personalized complexity.
Yeah, it comes back to self-awareness. Define your game. Know what you are trying to achieve with your money over your specific time horizon, given your unique risk tolerance. And actively filter out the noise and influence from people playing a completely different game with different goals and rules. And lastly, respect the mess. Accept that there's no single right answer in personal finance. There are best practices, sure, but ultimately it's about finding what works for you, for your psychology, for your life. Be okay with the fact that it might look different from someone else's perfect plan.
That's a great summary of principles. For us personally, trying to pull all these threads together in our own lives, it really means prioritizing independence above almost everything else. We consciously try to keep our lifestyle below our means, even when income goes up. We think of that extra savings as buying future freedom, putting it into an independence fund. The goal is just waking up one day knowing we have control over our time, that we can do what we want on our own terms.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And for us, that even led to making what, on paper, might look like the financially worst decision, paying off our mortgage early. Rationally, maybe we could have earned more by investing that money instead. But the psychological benefit, the feeling of complete independence from being totally debt-free, that outweighed any theoretical extra return. For us, it was the money-wise best decision.
Peace of mind has real value.
Huge value. We also keep a larger-than-typical cash buffer. Why? Because, like Charlie Munger said, the first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily. Having cash means we hopefully never have to sell investments at a bad time if an emergency hits. And our core investment strategy, honestly, it's boringly simple. Consistent, automatic dollar cost averaging into low-cost, diversified index funds, month in, month out. Does it guarantee beating the market? Nope. But it gives us, we believe, the highest probability of meeting our long-term goals without needing to be geniuses, without needing to predict the future, without needing excessive stress. We focus on controlling the things we can control, our savings rate, our own behavior, our patience, and maintaining a fundamental optimism in the long-term prospects of the global economy.
What a fascinating journey into the psychology of money. It really drives home that while the numbers obviously matter, it's the stories we tell ourselves, the unique experiences that shape our perspectives, and our often messy, unspoken emotions that play an even greater, maybe even decisive role in our financial lives.
Absolutely. So, as you, our listener, reflect on your own financial situation and decisions, maybe the most valuable question to ask yourself is this: what game are you truly playing with your money? Are you consciously aligning your actions with a game focused on long-term independence, resilience, and genuine happiness? Or are you perhaps inadvertently being swayed by the visible pursuits, the different games of others whose goals, circumstances, and time horizons might be profoundly different from your own? Understanding that distinction and acting on it, that might just be the most valuable financial insight of all.